Colossians 1:15-20. The supremacy of the Son of God. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, Colossians 1:15-20. Jesus teaches that Jesus is the point from which all things are directed and to which all things are focused. The Bible teaches that you can't understand how to be a human being, much less how to be a church, if you don't see reality this way. Paul's overall point is that Jesus is the centre of reality, but he points out 5 specific things that Jesus is. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn of all creation. He is before all things. He is the head of the body, the church, and he is the firstborn of the dead. Paul says Christ is the image of the invisible God in verse 15. Now, Paul is not thinking here of Christ's physical appearance, but to his character and nature. Genesis 1 says God made man in his image to reflect his character and nature to the world. But sin marred God's intentions for man. No one is able to perfectly reveal God. But when God's Son, Jesus, entered the world, he perfectly revealed God's character and glory. What is Paul's point in this passage, given much has already been mentioned in Genesis? Verse 18 says that in everything he might have the supremacy, meaning Jesus might have the supremacy. So Jesus is supreme, first, the centre, and we must live accordingly. This must be the reference point from which we understand everything else around us. What is the centre of your life? Perhaps your children, your family, your friends. For some it's money, for others happiness. It could be a job. The temptation for us is often high to allow something else to become the centre of our lives. But what are these things without Jesus? If we allow anything to replace Jesus as the centre, we are missing the most fundamental part of life. The very reason we are even here, our existence, to have and enjoy those other things. Another point I believe Paul is trying to emphasise here in this passage is that if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. This prevents us from making God into our image. In our minds, we tend to fashion God after our own thoughts and desires. We try to squeeze him into a mould and project onto him something he isn't. There is also a nod to the Trinity in verse 16. For in him all things were created. For in him all things were created. Now, Jesus was not created. He was and is to come. He has always been. But why is this important? Notice what Paul includes in the list of what Jesus created. In verse 16, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. Paul wanted to make clear that all authorities in heaven and on earth are under Jesus Christ's lordship and dominion. Yet another point Paul makes is Christ's relation to the new creation. Not only is Christ over creation, he is also over the new creation, the church. He is the head of the church. Verse 18 again points to that. The universal church throughout the ages is ruled by Christ, as is each local congregation of believers who profess him as Lord. Now, Christ achieved this status through his death and resurrection because he is, as verse 18 points out, the firstborn from the dead. He took the curse of creation upon himself to bring about a new creation and to reconcile all things to himself, making peace by the blood of his cross. Verse 20. Creation is now groaning to be set free and fully enter this peace Christ accomplished for us. Now we have a taster here on earth right now, but it's nothing in comparison to the full peace that Christ will offer in the new creation. So what does all of this mean? Well, Jesus Christ is God. Who he is, what he accomplished, and the future he holds for us should send our hearts soaring into worship. Jesus is incomparable. He is the centre of all things and should be the centre of our lives. He is supreme. He is the church. Basically, Jesus is everything, and without him, everything becomes nothing, pointless. Now, Colossians 1:15-20, for me, is such a magnificent passage of scripture, a Jesus hymn, if you like, that shows the enormity of what Christ has done and will do. It encourages us with the truth that Christ's life, death and resurrection have set into motion God's big plan to restore and reconcile all things. This includes the church, humanity and all of creation. Now, I'm going to read you a poem in a minute that I feel sums up this passage beautifully. But before I do, I'd like you to consider this week thinking on whether Jesus is the centre of your life. And if he's not, what is? And I'd like you to ponder on that and talk with God about that. And if you feel that maybe he's not quite at the centre, you can wrestle with that and talk to God and give it to God to change that. Because I really do believe that Jesus should always be at the centre. For as we said previously, without him at the centre, everything else is meaningless. So I'd like to end by sharing with you a poem by Dave Hopewood. It unfortunately doesn't have a name, but I think it's a beautifully put together homily and the verses we've just read and pondered on. So, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, God with flesh on, dressed in our clothes, walking, talking, weeping, laughing, eating, drinking, working, resting. For in him and through him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible. This physical world, the spiritual, emotional and psychological, people, places, planets and personalities. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the divine bond, the mediator, the Prince of Peace, the architect, holding the universe, holding people, holding the future. He is the head of the body, the church, this ragged collection of believers, this dysfunctional family, this holy temple, you and I, struggling to get along, holding his treasure in these stumbling bodies, these jars of clay. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might have first place in everything. Crucified, dead and buried, the ultimate sacrifice, resurrected and breathing new life into his followers. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, the compassion, the beauty, the strength, the creativity and good humour. He is the foundation and the finish, everything that was and will be. Amen.